Well, good day, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our User Stories webinar today. My name is Drew Jacobs, and I'm a member of the marketing team here at Rally, and I'll be playing a little bit of an MC role. This webinar is the second in our Enterprise Agile series, which we'll be playing throughout a good part of this year. And you'll see throughout this series we'll be addressing both core Agile concepts like this one, as well as more enterprise-level and advanced topics like multi-team release planning and Kanban a little later in the summer. In the room here today, I've got two of my colleagues, Bob Gower and Craig Langenfeld. Bob's an Agile coach here at Rally and has worked with many of our customers, large and small. Craig is a technical account manager, and he's going to spend a little bit of time today showing how Rally supports some of the concepts we're going to talk about here. And last, but certainly not least, we have Jeffrey Bourne joining us from Citibank. Jeff is a senior VP there and has worked really closely with Bob on some Agile projects at Citibank. He'll be sharing a lot of his stories and lessons learned during the webcast today as well. As an aside, too, he is writing a book on Agile, and his book entitled Agile Answered is due out in 2012. You can look for that from Addison Wesley. So thanks, Jeff, for joining us today.
Hey, thanks, Drew. This is Bob Gower from Rally Software, and I just want to start off with a little bit of agenda, some housekeeping. So we are going to focus on why, just like a good user story starts off with why. We're also going to start off with why user stories. We're going to look a little bit at user stories at the enterprise level, and actually that content's going to be distributed throughout this particular webinar. We're also going to cover story basics, and then where we really dig into the details at the end, it's going to be refining the stories and decomposition, which is really the critical skills that you need in order to write excellent user stories. So a little bit about my story. I started off in working with startups. That's where I learned to write user stories, and I realized very early on that if I was, after having used stories for a while, that if I was to have used stories earlier on, that I could have launched products much, much faster. So speed was really important to me. And the reason I think speed to market, user stories focus on speed to market or affect speed to market is because they allow us to focus on value. And they allow us to, instead of developing sort of everything and anything and everything, they allow us to develop just the things that really add value or determine what really adds value to our market. So this, of course, means that there's a lot of waste in our software. And one of the things I got really curious about was what other companies or who else was experiencing this level of waste. In other words, developing features that weren't really used or they were misused, as in the picture here. So this is going to lead us into our first poll, which is what percentage of software features are rarely or never used? And we have three choices here. We have less than 50%, about 64%, or over 80%. So why don't you go ahead and answer that, and we'll see what we've got. Oh, we've already got some answers coming in. Let me push these out so you guys can see them. And let's see if we have any more. All right, yeah, so it seems like a lot of us have all read this particular survey before. And yes, it's 64%. According to the Standish Group, it was a poll of some 8,000 software applications done back in 2006. About 64% of software features are rarely or never used. And this, of course, represents the biggest sort of waste within our industry. So it's not surprising that a lot of big companies are moving towards Agile. Like I say, my background as a product owner was in the Silicon Valley sort of startup culture, but also it's definitely entered the enterprise level, which is one of the reasons I was so happy to invite Jeff Bourne here today. So Jeff, we talked a little bit earlier sort of about valuable software. And the idea is that we're not talking just about working software, but we're talking about valuable software. I wonder if you could sort of weigh in on some of this intro here.
Sure. Thanks, Bob. So at Citi, we've tried to focus on creating a lot of business value in everything we deliver. And I'll relate a story that's kind of an interesting example. So one of my teams, one of my Agile teams, actually does iPad development. And when we first started the project, one of the user stories created was, well, we have some documents that are in simplified Chinese. We should support simplified Chinese. Seemed pretty obvious. And everyone has agreed, absolutely put this in. To this day, about 10 months later, we still have that story on our product backlog, and it has not been done, which, believe it or not, is a good thing. That means that higher priority, higher business value items took the place of doing what, in hindsight now, was a lower priority of adding in the multiple languages. If we had used the traditional waterfall of BRD, we would have absolutely put this item in for multiple languages. We would have developed it because it was in the requirements document, and it would have been delivered. But in its place, another feature of higher business value would not have been done given the same constraints of scope and timeline. So that's just an example of how using stories, using Agile, using the product backlog has really helped us focus on creating the most valuable software.
Great. So, and I think to your point, really what we're talking about with user stories is we're talking about connecting the vision of the product or the vision of the company all the way down to sort of the daily task level, to what's actually being worked on. And the user story is sort of the medium of communication that I see that we use all the way through that. Now, traditionally, of course, we've used sort of large requirements documents, and I know a lot of the people on our call today have experience or are currently working in an environment that uses large BRDs, PRDs, whatever you may call them, but the more traditional upfront requirements documents. And what I'd love to do is actually poll our audience again and find out sort of how satisfied you are with that traditional way of doing things. So you'll see a poll now coming up on your screen. It says, how satisfied are you with traditional product requirements documentation? And A is you love them. B is you neither love nor hate. It's sort of you're very neutral towards them. C is big requirements don't inspire my confidence. And I guess there may be a D, but we don't have that option for that. So let me see. Looks like we have some results coming in. I'm going to push these out so you all can see them as they come in. So we have a small subset of our audience does seem to love requirements documents, which doesn't surprise me. There are some good things about large requirements documents. A lot of people seem fairly indifferent, but it seems like over half are not so inspired by the confidence of them, or by confidence in requirements documents. Yeah, about 58%. So Jeff, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your experience. I know you've worked in a sort of a heavy requirements doc world. You've also worked in an Agile, more story-based development world. What's been your experience with the big requirements docs?
I've always found that the requirement documents, they give a very nice, secure feeling. And if you have a big document, you even print it out, it looks very much like you spent a lot of time doing the analysis, really thinking it through, and this is going to be a solid product that you release. But I've also found that in reality that doesn't always work out that way, because when you create one of these larger documents, you're doing it in a predictive manner, meaning you're assuming that you can figure out all the requirements, every little bit and piece, and it's a done, sealed document, and everyone can fully understand it and go forward with it. But in reality, it really needs to be adaptive. And that's where things such as change requests, I'm sure many of you have felt the pain of going through change requests and resisting change or changing these documents. So it's always been a challenge with these large documents that are signed, sealed, and delivered. And with Agile, we found a new medium that has allowed us to be a lot more adaptive to the changing business requirements as business value changes or new ideas emerge. We can actually accept them. And Agile facilitates that acceptance of change as opposed to what I always have found with traditional requirements, resist change after sign-offs are done.
Yeah, and I'd agree with all of that. And I think the key pieces that I see with it, or the key limitations I see of large requirements documents, is there's no indication of relative value, as with the story, your story about the feature that wasn't developed, and that being a good thing, is that if that's in a requirements doc, it's automatically going to get worked on, and that sort of non-critical feature can hold up the rest of the more critical features. Also, we talked about that they become increasingly irrelevant over time, that these requirements docs, because they're not updated, they become actually poor indicators of what's actually in production. And there's also not an explicit opportunity to apply learning back into the product development cycle over time. But I do have just a quick question for you, because one of the critiques I hear, or concerns that I think a lot of people have in an Agile environment is, what about deadlines, or what about meeting deadlines? Because, as you say, these requirements docs do give us an opportunity to be predictive, or they at least the illusion or the indication that we're predictive.
So to meet the deadlines, we usually, when we try to use these documents, we often find that we miss the deadlines anyway because new requirements do come up, and we start doing these various change requests. So that pushes out any deadline that we've set ahead of time. So now in our Agile methodology, what we do is we look at the true capacity of the team, our true ability to deliver, which is our velocity, and that helps set what we're going to be releasing and when we're going to be releasing it. And a lot of this is driven, actually I'd say it's mainly driven by the user stories, us estimating the user stories, and us prioritizing the user stories.
Great, thanks. And I'm just going to throw a couple of quick quotes at you, and then we can take some questions and then drill down into the sort of the how we're going to write user stories. So the quotes I like, one comes from our Agile fellow here at Rally, Gene Tabeka, which is, a well-written story doesn't lie, requirements do by their sheer volume of content. And then this is my favorite from Mike Tyson, which is, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. And I always think of stories like we can respond to getting punched in the mouth or getting punched in the market as it is much faster, much better. So I want to open it up right now. I'm going to ask Drew to kind of pull off a couple of questions for us, and we'll pause before we start digging into the actual nuts and bolts of how to write great user stories.
Yeah, we got a couple of questions coming in that I think are repeating a theme here a little bit. How do you all typically see teams kind of circulate or get consensus on user stories with the rest of the organization and probably in particular stakeholders or business owners?
Well, I mean, actually, this is a great question, because how do you write great user stories? You write them collaboratively, and you have to come up with collaborative systems, collaborative, meetings, ways for the team to be talking to each other. It's not one individual that writes user stories. It's the team that develops, writes, decomposes them together over time. Jeff, maybe you can speak to how you guys do that at Citibank.
Sure. I couldn't agree more with what you said about the collaboration. It's the entire team coming together. So in our sessions, whether we write the user stories within a sprint planning session or a grooming session, which I think we'll speak more about later, what we do is we have the whole team there. That means we have the developers, we have the business/product owner, we have the UAT and QA, architecture. Everyone comes together to help define and refine these stories. But an important piece about this is that the team as a whole, and especially the product owner, needs to be empowered to create and drive the direction. There's a problem always if you have to go and say, I'm sorry, I have to bring these stories to a committee and they have to vote on it. That is going to hinder the whole initiative and the ability to quickly deliver. So it's really important to enable the business owner to have the authority to make decisions on, is this a worthwhile user story or not, and what the priority is against it.
Great. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. As a former product owner, I couldn't agree more that you really do need to empower the product owner to make the up-down decisions, and at the same time, you need to be collaborative. It seems to me like all Agile processes, there's a combination of flexibility and discipline. I mean, that's to me is agility is essentially the dynamic tension between those two. Do you have another question?
Yeah, maybe we'll just take time for one more. Yeah. And this one is kind of a role team-related one, too. And just for everyone on the line, we're getting a lot of questions around sizing and estimating and splitting user stories. We're going to get into that in just a few minutes, so I'll hold off on those, but we've got some good team-related questions here. And this one really is around, and we've seen this a couple times over the last couple webinars, how does the business analyst role change, and especially in relation to maintaining a backlog of user stories?
Yeah, well, it depends on the organization. And Jeff, I'm actually going to throw this out to you. How does the BA role work at, or how has it changed in your environments?
Well, it again depends on the team, even within Citi. So we do have BAs on the team, and they play various roles. Sometimes the BA is actually the product owner. At times, they actually are partner with the product owner, and they are partially the liaison with the product owner and the rest of the team, where the team, instead of approaching the product owner for a lot of daily questions, approaches the BA. But in that scenario, the BA is much more empowered than they are in a traditional waterfall. So it varies, but there absolutely is a place and many times a need for that analyst who is an expert in that area.
Great, thanks. So now let's move on. We're going to go through some of the nuts and bolts of user stories just so we all have sort of a baseline of what we're working on here. Now we think of user stories as really having three key components. There's the card, there's the conversation, and there's the confirmation. Let's start off with the card piece. So the card is really you want your user story, there we go, your user story to fit on a card. And it wants to encapsulate three things, the who, the what, and the why. The role, like who it is we're building something for, what it is they want, what they're trying to accomplish, and why they're trying to accomplish that. And we always think of this as sort of this is encapsulated business value. So in language you've captured an indication of like if you were able to provide this capability to somebody that they would be willing to pay for it essentially. So it's an encapsulation of business value in language as a who, I want what, so that why. Now that's great, but it's somewhat useless unless there's a conversation wrapping around that. And let's talk about let's walk through a conversation. We're going to take this out of technology a little bit so perhaps it's a little more clear. So as a busy breakfast maker, I wanted the toast to pop up when it's done so that I can focus on other things while it's cooking. We can see why this would be valuable, right? We're making some toast, but we're already able to make toast, but the toast popping up when it's done, this is potentially a useful thing to someone who doesn't want their toast to burn and wants to be able to focus on other things. And it also seems like a reasonable request. And here in this next slide, we have a very, very handsome, no, this is not me, but a very handsome product owner making this request in conversation to a developer. So I want the toast to pop up when it's done. The developer is going to comes back and says, well, that's really expensive. The popping up part is easy. That's just a spring. But knowing when the toast is done, it's going to require an optical sensor. This is new technology. And this is going to be something that's going to take quite a while to develop. Now, we can see if we were in a traditional throw-it-over-the-wall requirements world that this developer might have already started working on this rather than having this very crucial conversation. Conversation comes back to the developer or to the product owner, and they says he's curious. What about all those other toasters out there? Developer comes back and says, well, they don't use a timer. It's a kludge. They just, they use a timer. They don't know when the toast is really done. And the product owner, of course, doesn't want a super toaster. He just wants a regular toaster like everybody else. And here they are happy having met in the middle at the end. You can see how important this conversation is. There's a lot of information exchange that would have been very challenging to even know if it was needed, before when we're writing a core requirements document. But because we're using a story-based development, encouraging conversation, encouraging this collaborative way of doing things, that we're actually building in a lot more detail and saving ourselves quite a bit of work. Now, this drives us to the third C, which is confirmation. And this is how will we know when we're done? How will we know when we're actually complete with this particular feature? And here we are going to go into technology. I'm going to share this particular story, which is a traveler. I want to be able to cancel a reservation so that I'm not charged if my plans change. So this would be like a traveler's website, and it seems very reasonable. But how would we know when this is actually done? What could be testable? What could we actually test for? And this is where we capture things in what we call acceptance criteria. So the email confirmation is sent to the primary email address. A 10% fee is charged to the account. The hotel is notified of the cancellations. The hotel is removed from the itinerary immediately. So now what we have is we have an encapsulated business value in the card. In the conversation, we've elaborated, and so we've created a shared understanding. And now here in the acceptance criteria, we've created a series of sort of up, down, testable scenarios so we know when we're actually finished and we know when we're actually done. Jeff, is there anything you wanted to add to this?
What you just described here is an extremely important piece of our whole process. So when we create user stories, we just don't stop at the user story and say, all right, here you go, team, go build it. There are the two other components are the acceptance criteria and then the detailed tasks. So building out what is the acceptable, how do we know when we're actually done and have created at the end of an iteration potentially shippable software is an important guideline and piece of knowledge for everyone on the team. Because otherwise, one could fairly say a user story doesn't provide enough information. That information starts surfacing for us at the acceptance criteria level, then directly built off of the acceptance criteria are the detailed tasks, or as some people call them, engineering tasks. And those engineering tasks end up being what the team builds against.
Yeah. Yeah, and you can see sort of how each of these pieces of acceptance criteria then break down into the task, right? So that's great. And so I want to actually show, kind of continuing with our theme of decomposition, which is not a very attractive word for it perhaps, but it is what we do. We do take larger things and make them into smaller things. I want to go back to our sort of our breakfast scenario here. And so here we might have a theme, which is a big, like as a busy person, as a busy professional, I want to eat breakfast, so I can be nourished for my day. That might be our theme. And this may break down into 3 what we call epics. We could also call these, they could be potentially product lines. They could be potentially features. It depends upon the organization. But we would have coffee, toast, and juice being the 3 things that breakfast could break into. And it could potentially break into more, obviously. And then each of these things, in order to accomplish them, are going to break into stories. Now, these epics might decompose into other epics because the story is sort of the developable piece, that small enough chunk that we can use, that we can actually pull into an iteration. And so we might have to go through. There might be a little more of a gradient. These show really clean lines, and I don't want to kind of fool you. There actually is often a gradient. Epics decompose into epics, which even decompose into more epics before we can break it down to the story level. It's a bit of an art here. I also want to just kind of show you that we could draw a line around these and say, well, what's our minimum viable product for release within this? And it could be that coffee, we only need 2 of our stories. We don't need the third, like espresso story. We only need the basic coffee story. And juice, we don't need the fresh squeeze story. We only need the out of the jar story, something like that. But we get a sense of sort of by prioritizing these in terms of business value, we can then begin to draw these circles around it and say, well, what is the minimum viable product that we really want to release with? And actually, Jeff, do you have anything to add, or shall we just go straight to some questions?
Just one other thing to add is about how we actually, on my teams, we break down the stories. So everything is in the context of the product vision. So what is the vision we're trying to achieve? And then we start making user stories. Now, a lot of times these user stories are quite large. As we saw in the previous example, they're massive. It might be something that could encompass 10 people for 3 months to do. But that's okay. We actually want that because by taking the bigger picture, we can break it down to get to the detailed level and user stories that we can complete within a sprint. And just one other point about what we do with how many do we have in a sprint, et cetera. We typically have sprints or iterations that are 2 weeks long. I prefer to have about 4 to 8 stories. People do various ones. They do 1 to 2. They could do 16, 20. It's really up to the team and organization. I like the 4 to 8 because it's just enough for the team to have ones they can start checking off and accomplish. So if they can only get up to 6 or 7, then they still did 6 or 7 out of the 8. As opposed to if you had 1 or 2, that means if you don't do 1, you only did 50% of the ones you committed to. If you did none, if you have only 1, you did 0. So it's a nice size for us to say, for a 2-week iteration, let's break it down to the level so the team can commit to 4 to 6 stories.
Great. And with that, I think we can take a few minutes of questions before going to a demo about how this works in the real world and a real application.
Yeah, let's take a couple here. I think a really good kind of process-related question of when are user stories put together? Do you do that before the project gets started, or do you do it right thereafter in your first sprint planning meeting? How do you guys typically see that play out in an Agile team?
Well, I love to work with stories and story cards before a project gets started to get a sense of what the minimum set is. But then you don't want to do too much elaboration because you're just trying to get enough to get going and get a sense of what the highest priority things are to work on. Jeff, do you have some examples from Citibank or how you guys do things there?
Yes. So I think you hit the nail on the head where you don't want to walk into your first sprint planning session, brand new team, with nothing. You want to prep it with some user stories, especially get the product vision. And these stories can be epic size, but that's a great starting place. Now, for the stories, you're going to have new stories throughout the life cycle. It goes back to, can you think of everything beforehand? If you can, and you can get it down to the most minute detail at the beginning, then go for the BRD. But that typically doesn't happen. So expect, and that's what we always do, every sprint planning, every grooming session, we think of new items, new business focus, new value, refine them, change the stories, So it's a continuous emergent process throughout.
Great. That's perfect. Couldn't say it better myself. Do we have another question?
Yeah, let's do one more, and it might be a good lead-in to some of the stuff Craig's going to demo a little bit. We got a questionnaire I've seen a couple times. When we think about how Agile focuses on features around business value and how those kind of boil up to maybe a roadmap level and then obviously translate down into features, how would you guys generally define business value? What are the components of that?
Components of business value? Well, I'll let my customer define it for one thing. I mean, are people buying what you're selling? And I think one of the benefits of going, again, to sort of a continuous integrative environment which story-based development lends itself to is you get stuff out there in the market very fast and you get to test it and find out, you kind of let the market tell you what's doing. But of course, business value is also, going back to the conversation with the delivery team, it's always going to be, we're going to weigh value that we're going to get against the cost of actually getting it. And so the prioritization of something is not something that I can do as a product owner in isolation. I need to be in conversation with the development team to understand how expensive it is, how difficult it is, and what the implications are for the rest of our application, not just sort of saying, this is valuable, develop it. Jeff, did you have anything you want to add to that?
Sure. I think that's a really good question because I'm not sure if you ever heard the book Zen, the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, that deals with the whole question of what is value and what is quality. But it needs to be defined by the team as a whole, and especially it's guided mainly by the product owner. So we have business value from everything from obvious, let's add on this new feature for an external client or an internal client. Let's fix a bug that's been a real pain, so it has a lot more business value than new features, to this is something that's promoting the team within the larger company. So that also has different business value. But I just have one comment on, during the prioritization, the business value is the primary driver for us, but that's not the only siloed prioritization. It's taken as a whole, where it's business value helps drive what goes to the top, but considerations around dependencies, technical feasibility, the time, all of those play in, and the team gives the input about this information to the product owner. And I'll give a little example. You might have something, well, this new feature that you have adding on, say, be able to submit new papers or submit new publications from the client, extremely high business value, but it's an epic and it will take about 2 months to build for the team. Will, of course, break it down. This other feature, let's say adding on a little button, is a lot easier. We can do it in a couple days, but it's less business value. Well, we might as a team decide, even though this is less business value, it can be done right away and it's quicker to market, so maybe even increasing the business value. Let's do that small button first. So it's always a negotiation and an educated decision process.
Okay, great. And with that, I'm going to hand things off to one of our talented technical account people, Craig Langenfeld, to show us sort of how this might work in the real world.
Yeah, thank you for that great lead-in, Jeff. That's exactly what we're going to talk about, or what I'm going to demonstrate now. We all know that user stories provide great business value, right? And that's really the key concept of a user story. But I want to show in some of Jeff's examples and how he talked about how they work at Citibank, scaling a user story beyond just a piece of work that is developed or a piece of value that's developed in a single iteration, but also scaling that up to what it means to the business. So let's pause just a second while I kick off the product demonstration. Okay, I'm going to show us really 3 key areas, kind of what Jeff talked about earlier, and that is prioritizing those high-level business objectives on a roadmap so that we can easily see what we have planned for the next 4 quarters. I want to show how those business objectives, in this case themes, are broken down into user stories that will be worked on in a 2-week period, either by a single team or a cross-team. And then I also want to show how that status of that user story can be reflected back to signal the business in terms of what the next priorities are that we should work on. So we can easily see by our roadmap view here that the individual themes are planned into quarters, so much like Jeff might plan their themes. We can also see that we have on the left a roadmap column that shows the themes that have not yet been planned. So we're looking at our consumer site product line, and maybe in this scenario we have a theme new consumer portal, and maybe one of our chief competitors has just released a new consumer portal that has the utmost and extreme ability to be customized, consumer portal that can be customized, as well as some security features. So we want to increase the urgency of our features in our product. So we're going to go ahead and move these features like customizable consumer portal into Q2, and then you'll see strong password login into Q3. So we're going to increase the urgency of the features that we're going to work on. Well, after we've planned these into the quarters, let's spin down into the Rally application and take a closer look at the work. So from the Rally application, on the user stories page, we can see that our theme, new consumer portal, shows up, and we have two features planned. The feature that we'll talk about is the customizable consumer portal. It's the one we want to work on in Q2. So from this theme, we've broken down 3 user stories that, as Jeff mentioned, can span releases, iterations, and might even span multiple Agile teams. One of the key benefits of using a tool like Rally is now we can aggregate the work that we're working on so that we can see a nice roll-up of information back up to the theme level. Let's spin down and take a closer view of one of the user stories, Add Dashboard Panels. This user story is currently being worked on in iteration 6, so I'll navigate to the iteration status page for the shopping team. We can easily see that there are 5 days remaining for the shopping team in this iteration. Our user story, Add Dashboard Panels, is the highest priority for this team to work on in this iteration. It's been decomposed, and the team has told us that it'll take 3 tasks to complete the work. Let's go ahead and finish the last task, which is a code review. And once we've completed that work, the user story will signal to the product owner that the work has been completed. We're going to go ahead and take a closer look at the user story. As a product owner, we may want to see what did we originally describe for intent, and what's the acceptance criteria on this user story. If the product owner finds it suitable, we'll go ahead and accept the user story, and the team will receive credit for 5 points of business value achieved by completing this user story. Now let's go ahead and spin back to our roadmap view and see how Add Dashboard Panels has affected the key feature that we're working on. The feature, Customizable Consumer Portal, is in Q2, so we'll take a closer look at Q2, and we can easily see that by completing the one user story, we've completed 45% of our key feature. So from this, we looked at planning our themes and reprioritizing our themes on a roadmap. We spun down and looked at how teams can work on user stories in an iteration, and then we took another view and looked back at how that user story signaled the business and reflected back onto the roadmap.
Great. Thanks a lot, Craig. Let me get back to my view so I can see what's going on here. So as you can see, we've talked a lot about sort of refining stories and decomposing stories. And so now I'd love to introduce you sort of a framework, actually, that Jeff and I talked about ahead of time. But it's a framework called DEEP. Comes to us from Mike Cohn. And as you can guess by the all caps, it's an acronym, DEEP. The first D, and again, this is a way of thinking about our stories as we refine them and as we get more detail out of them. And also we're going to talk about how we decompose stories, how we take bigger stories and break them into smaller stories. That's kind of what we're going to finish off this webinar with. So DEEP is detailed appropriately. And Jeff, why don't you take it away?
Sure. So This concept for us is very important. The deep and the first D, the detailed appropriately, means that we take each story and we put it as much definition as it needs. So what we mean by that is if something is an epic, something that is at the bottom of our priority list where epics typically are, we don't put as much detail around it. We don't spend the time because the different notions, thoughts, ideas aren't there yet, and we shouldn't spend the time on it yet to go into that level of detail. As we get closer and increase the priority of various items and then go up on the product backlog in priority, that's when we increase the level of detail. And that level of detail could mean refining the user story, being more clear about it, breaking up the user story into multiple ones. We even sometimes combine them together. They're too detailed, and we pull them back up into a single user story, and then taking those user stories and decomposing them into the acceptance criteria and then the detailed tasks. So that's a very important concept for us to always try to not go in either direction, too detailed or not detailed enough, and we're guided by where it is in the priority, and is it upcoming for us to actually do within a sprint.
Yeah, my favorite answer when people ask how much detail or how much acceptance criteria do we need to have in our user stories, I always say as much as necessary and as little as possible, which I know is kind of it's sort of a dodging answer, and yet it really is true. And I think teams and organizations need to figure out, how much detail is enough to make sure that the right thing is being built, but not to overwhelm your sort of extrapolation process early on, because you can burn up a lot of time detailing things that you're never going to build. And one of the things that sort of illustrates this is that in this particular slide here is our product backlog. As things rise in priority, they should also rise in detail. So in other words, something way down at the bottom, which is low priority, we really don't want to have too much detail about, because we'll have spent some valuable time that we could have spent working on other things and detailing out what that might be. But that said, we want to have enough detail there when we're ready to work on something. So there's sort of this telescoping process. The other thing that might not be exactly clear from this is that as we detail something out, we're also able to pull detail out and deprioritize certain aspects of that, certain details of a larger epic. Certain of those user stories that don't fit in our minimum viable product, we could actually pull those out. So some of that detail actually could then get deprioritized as well. So it's a little hard to draw, so we kept it kind of simple here. And then, we're still in the go deep here. The detailed appropriately, the next would be estimated. And Jeff, why don't you talk to us about what's estimation and what's that about?
So this is another important concept that we practice, and this is estimating the stories. So there's many reasons why we do this. One, we get a sense of how big the stories are when we use story points against it. So we have a product backlog. We have it prioritized, but part of the prioritization we do against it is having it estimated first. So we figure out in story points how big relatively is this user story. And that helps us to figure out where it should go in the priority list. Should we break it up? Because the team is estimating it, as those are familiar with it, 13 or 20 size. That's probably a good candidate to be broken up. Is it maybe too small? It's a 1 or 0. We can now combine it together. Also, it gives a great sense when you estimate the whole backlog as a manager to figure out, if I have an upcoming release on this and this date, what can I accomplish based on my capacity and past velocity? So I can take an estimated backlog and say, well, I have another 2 sprints left. I want to have a release then. I have a capacity of past velocity of 30 points. So obviously I can do 60 points worth of work. And that will allow you to estimate what you can do when. So it's a very important point for both a prioritization and also management for release scheduling.
Absolutely, yeah. Like I said before, value is you have to indicate cost as well as the value received from a feature, and so estimation is really where it's how the product owner gets to know, sort of how much something's going to cost him, or her. So the next E is emergent. Talk about that a little bit, Jeff?
So I mentioned before emergence. So that really goes a theme I found throughout Agile and what our team really practices, where we're trying to not be predictive, but being adaptive, where new ideas, new thoughts come out. And that goes into an epic, where we're not afraid of building out epics, and we don't want to spend, as detailed appropriately, too much time against them, because new thoughts, new items will emerge. And it also goes with, can we think of everything ahead of time? No. That's why the product backlog is going to grow and change over time. So new ideas we've refined will be emerged, and we try to accept that, as Agile as a whole does, any of those changes. Now, just a thought on that, because you might say, well, if it's emerging, things are changing, that could cause problems for the team. Every 2 weeks, we commit to doing X number of user stories, and that becomes our sprint backlog. And during that time, we don't change what has been committed to. It's only during our planning session that we allow new items, new priorities to emerge for us, and then we can commit to those.
Great. And then the last, the P is prioritize, which we've discussed quite a bit. Do you have any parting shots on prioritization?
No, it's just we try to do also prioritization during grooming session, or grooming the backlog, which is prior to our every 2-week planning session. So what we do is we go through it again, do other estimates, create new ones, and actually try to do prioritization to get it prepared and ready for the upcoming planning session.
Yeah, absolutely. And we talked about we have several sort of fixed kinds of meetings. Our daily stand-up, our sprint planning, our retrospectives, our demos, that kind of thing, within a traditional Scrum or Agile process. But the backlog grooming is one that I find that each team, again, has to tune for themselves and, again, do as much as necessary and as little as possible in order to have sort of vision and enough detail, maybe 2 or 3 sprints ahead in their backlog is the rule of thumb that I usually use in terms of prioritization. And, of course, that can change, though, sprint to sprint. A couple more things I wanted to just kind of introduce you to really quick for our participants here. These are in the packets that you've received. And then I wanted to actually go to questions. I want to try to save as much time as I can for questions because we have a lot of great questions coming through. This is another framework. It comes from Bill Wake. It's called INVEST. Good stories are independent, negotiable, valuable, estimable, sized appropriately, and testable. I think those kind of speak for themselves, and there is a lot of great writing about it out there. I think we've introduced enough framework, so I'm going to sort of gloss over this slide for now, just so we can get to some of your more detailed questions that are coming up. Also in your packet, you'll find that we have 20 ways to split user stories, and again, this also comes from Bill Wake. But these are the sort of different tests or different kinds of heuristics you can use when you're thinking about, when you have a big story that you know has to be broken up, how are you going to break it up? And what might you do, how might you think about this in a way so you can break it down into that developable piece, that piece that can be developed over, developable is a challenging word, but they can be developed over a 2-week period.